Good morning, and thank you for joining us. Today's webinar is on the Teledyne Tekmar Lumin, the next generation of purge and trap performance. It is presented by Jacob Rebholz, our VOC product line manager. We will be accepting questions, so please feel free to submit them throughout the presentation, and we will address them at the end. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Jacob.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Okay, so let's start with an outline of the topics we're going to cover today. I'm going to start with a brief introduction of purge and trap theory, how it works, why we use it. From there, we'll go to an introduction for the Tekmar Lumin itself. That'll be followed by a brief refresher on the Aquatek 100, which is our liquids-only water auto sampler, And then from there, we'll discuss an example application on the Lumin, and then we'll cover some application support type stuff. And then we will finish with questions. So let's start with introduction to purge and trap theory. So the way purge and trap works is on equilibrium theory. In other words, volatiles that are in a liquid phase are going to transition to a gas phase until they reach an equilibrium. For instance, in Headspace, when you have a sealed system, given enough time, those analytes will come into a balance between the liquid and the gaseous phases, and then we can sample a portion of that headspace, analyze it, and see what's in our sample. That works really well when we have a high concentration of analytes in our liquid sample, but if we have really trace concentrations, we may not get a high enough concentration in the gas phase in order to get an adequate sample. So in that case, we would be looking at purge and trap. And so purge and trap works on a disequilibrium theory. In other words, we're constantly replacing that headspace, so the concentration in the headspace is always at or very near to zero. So our VOCs of interest will always be moving from that more highly concentrated liquid state up into the gaseous phase. So that's how purge and trap works. And we use it again because we often are looking at samples with really trace concentrations where headspace wouldn't give us a high enough sample size. So the purge efficiency is controlled by several parameters, just a few of which are listed here. And it's important when we develop methods for purge and trap concentrators that we choose, we keep all of these in mind. So we keep the vapor pressure of the compound of interest in mind. That's going to drive maybe the temperature we want to purge at. Also, the solubility of the compound in water is going to play a role in temperature that we purge, length of time that we purge for, and the volume of purge gas that we want to run through that sample. So all of these factors come into play with method development and also with concentrator system development. So when we were designing the Lumin, we kept some of these parameters in mind so that we could build the system to be that much more efficient. Now, for a much more in-depth coverage of purge and trap concentration and how that works, I would encourage you to go to our website, www.teledynetekmar.com, navigate to the webinars page, and seek out our Purge and Trap 101 webinar, which has a really nice comprehensive overview of how purge and trap works, the theory behind it, how we choose some of those method parameters. And then if you're looking for a little more in-depth information on EPA methods or non-traditional methods, you can check out our 201 and 301 series. And so those webinars are going to cover much more in depth than the brief detail I've covered here. But keeping these things in the back of our mind, we can now move forward and speak toward the Lumin directly. Okay, so last but not least, just one more brief thing about purge and trap systems. Again, just to go over the major components here, we have our 6-port valve that's going to control the various flows within the system. We have our samples being purged. We have our trap, and then we have our GC system. And so when we're in the purge mode, we're running purge gas through that liquid sample, we're stripping out the volatiles of interest, and then we're concentrating those on a trap. And then when we go into desorb mode, we're now going to heat that trap very rapidly to free those compounds that have been captured. We're going to back flush them using the GC carrier gas into the inlet of the GC where we'll separate and detect those compounds. And I bring this up because there's a couple different features here that are going to control the efficiency of the system. Primarily, we're looking at trapping. So how well can we trap these compounds? How efficiently can we heat that trap to release them? send them over as one tight band, and then how quickly can we cool the system back down to get ready for the next sample. The other half of concentrator design that's of great interest is also going to be moisture management. So as we're purging these compounds out of our liquid sample, keep in mind that water vapor is also a volatile compound. So water is going to come out in a vapor form, and then when it reaches the cooler oven of the GC, it's going to condense back out, and we're going to have water that's going to cause issues. So we need to pre-condense that moisture out before it makes it to our detector. So that's the other critical design factor that goes into these decisions when building new instruments. Okay, so now we've covered those things, let's get into the Teledyne Tekmar Lumin. So this is our next generation standalone purge and trap concentrator, and we had two main goals when we were designing this instrument. First and foremost is always to improve analytical performance. So we wanted this instrument to be a step forward and a step above our previous offerings as far as analytical quality is concerned. But the other thing that was very prominent in our minds at the same time was return on investment and usability of the instrument. So we wanted to improve some of the main areas where customers are typically working on the concentrator. We wanted to improve the interface with the concentrator, so our software. All of the little things that affect your day-to-day use of the concentrator, we wanted to see if we couldn't improve those to some extent. So the Tekmar Lumin is a direct replacement for the Stratum Purge and Trap concentrator and the Velocity XPT. In other words, if you have one of these systems, you could take it off and you could put your Lumin right in place. In keeping with those attempts to improve some of the analytical quality of the instrument and some of that maintenance and serviceability, we've added some new features, including faster trap cooldown rates. We've consolidated all of the solenoid valves into one location, which gives a much more intuitive layout of the inside of the instrument and makes service and maintenance a little easier. And then we have a new moisture control system that really helps to reduce the amount of moisture that makes it to the GC. And so that really helps with analytical quality. So with getting better gas results on the front end of your analyses, better reproducibility of standards and internal standards, things of that nature. And then last but not least, we also did an overhaul of our software, and we changed the way that we communicate with the concentrator. So instead of using RS-232 cables like our previous models did, we're now using USB. So RS-232 ports are an increasingly rare thing on today's PCs, so USB is a much more user-friendly way to interface with the concentrator. Okay, so how did we achieve some of these goals? The first and foremost is a simplified layout of the internal components of the concentrator itself. So some of the things we looked at with previous models is the amount of effort it takes to change a trap, which is sort of like buying new tires on your car. It's not something you do every day, but it's something that you'll have to do at some point. Traps do wear out. When you go to replace a trap, how much time and effort is it going to take you to do that? Do you have to bust out the manual to figure out how to get to the trap, or is it a nice, easy thing to do? In keeping with that, we wanted to bring all of those valves into one location. So in the event that you may have an issue with your concentrator, you're getting overpressure sensing, or you're not having your sample drain properly, things like this are going on, and you think it might be tied to a valve malfunction, well, where do you find those valves? We brought them all into one location, so you have one spot to look for those valves. Makes it a little easier to do benchmark testing and then any type of servicing that the instrument may need. In keeping with that, we've also brought the pressure regulator for the foam elimination system into the concentrator. So whereas on our previous models, we would have an external concentrator that would need some bench space, somewhere to sit physically next to your concentrator, and it would need its own gas connection, and it would need to be hooked up at the time of installation. Now that pressure regulator is mounted on the solenoid valve manifold, and it's internal to the instrument. So that means your Lumin comes fully plumbed from the factory, ready for foam elimination. There are no other connections to make other than the one gas connection at the back of the unit. And that just gets teed off. Part of it goes to the pressure regulator to run the foam elimination system, and the other goes to the mass flow controller, which then controls all of the purge, dry purge, and bake flows throughout the instrument. And then last but not least, from a hardware standpoint, we've added a new integrated glassware surround that's going to do a much better job of protecting the sparger from any type of accidental impact, whether that be a broom handle when the lab is being swept out, or an analyst bumps into it and shatters it. And it also is going to protect the user from the heated sample mount so that you can't accidentally touch that as you walk past the instrument. You may brush into it, things like that. So before we start looking at just what makes the Lumin trap access so great, let's take a step back and refresh our memories of what the Stratum trap access looks like. So here's a picture of a Stratum ready to have its trap changed. Now, in order to get to this point, we have 4 screws and we need 2 different tools. So we have 2 Phillips screws that hold the side panel on. You lift that off, you pull the trap door open. It's not so bad. Now you can see your trap. However, you can't get to the nuts to actually take the trap out. In order to do that, we have to open the top lid here, remove a thumb screw, pull off the oven cover, or the valve oven cover, excuse me, and then we have a flathead screw that retains this piece of insulation. Pull that out. Now we have access to our trap nuts. So now we can take those nuts out, take the trap off, slide it out of the heater sleeve, slide in our new one, and then reassemble. If you're not terribly familiar with the Stratum, or if you weren't doing this task on a regular basis, it can be a little cumbersome to remember all of these steps to tear in and get to your trap. So by comparison, the Lumin has 1 door access, and there are no tools required. All you do is simply grasp this little tab, and you pull, and here's your trap box. So you now have full unrestricted access to the trap box, including your trap nuts. You'll also notice that all of those solenoid valves have moved onto 1 manifold, which is also located behind this door. So now if you're running a benchmark test and you want to check the flow of your mass flow controller, you can put your flow meter right on your vent, which is right here in the front, nice and easy to get to. You don't have to remove any panels, and you can check your flows. Similarly, if you have a leak in your system and you're trying to track it down and you think it may be a loose fitting, all of your connections are right here in the front where they're really easy to check. You can snug them up or you can check them for leaks. And if you're replacing a valve, should one go bad, real nice easy access from the right-hand side panel. So you take 1 panel off and now you have full unrestricted access to all of those valves in 1 location. So just to refresh again here, with the old trap oven design, a trap lives partially in the trap box, and it also lives partially in the valve oven. And so you have to open up both of those spaces in order to get to it. Something else I'll point out here too, just to point it out at the moment, we'll touch on it later, is here's where your fan is that blows into your trap box on the Stratum. So your fan is underneath, and it's blowing air up through, and that air then has to escape through the short portion of the door here into the chassis. With the new design, it's much simpler to change out traps. So we have full access to both of these nuts from within the trap box. So again, once you pull that door open, you can now get to your nuts, you can take your trap off, install the new trap, shut the door, and you're ready to run again. You don't have to pull apart your valve oven, you don't have to pull side panels off the instrument. You don't have to get out any tools other than the wrench that you need for the trap nuts themselves. And that's really all it takes. The other nice thing is that we've stuck with the U-shaped trap. So we have all the benefits that the U-shaped trap provides, which is a shorter path length, more consistent heating. So we keep all of the fittings on both ends, live up there in the valve oven where they can stay nice and consistently hot. And that's going to reduce our carryover, that's going to reduce potential contamination, and it's going to reduce cold spots where things may hang up. We're also using the U-shaped trap because it then gives you a simpler consumable stocking. So you'll have the same traps that will work for your Stratums, your Atomixes, and your Lumins. So if you have a mix of any of these instruments in your laboratory, you don't have to concern yourself with stocking multiple different styles of traps. So instead of having 1 or 2 for each concentrator on hand, you can keep 2 or 3 total, and then as you use one, just order a replacement. We're also sticking with the sleeve here. It gives reliable, proven heating. It's been tested and used successfully in the Stratum and the Atomics, so we've continued forward with that. And then we've also improved our cool down times. And so the way we've done that is we're now blowing the air in. We have an insulated box, which is going to help keep some of the heat bleed from the chassis from coming in, like power supplies, valve oven. Keep that heat from coming into our trap when we don't want to be heating it. Keep the trap from heating other zones of the instrument when we don't want it to heat them. And we've also redesigned how our fan pulls air. And so the way we've done that is we've added dedicated ductwork to the trap cooling fan that forces it to pull its cooling air from outside the chassis. So it's pulling in lab cool air. Whereas on the Stratum, it's pulling the air from within the instrument itself. So any air that may have been heated by the valve oven or by power supplies or boards, that warm air is being used to cool. And so as you can imagine, a cooler source air is going to cool much faster. And just to improve on that even further, we have a more powerful fan that delivers more air, which also helps reduce the cooling time. And so we've seen cooling reductions of up to 22% or better over previous models. So it really cuts down runtime. So total sample runtime is shortened, which means more samples per day, more samples per month, per year. So now let's speak a little bit about the solenoid valves. So on the Stratum, we can see here that we have two different locations where the solenoid valves lived. The purge, bake, and vent valves lived in the upper left-hand corner of the instrument. And then the drain valve and the associated foam elimination valves, if your system was so equipped, lived in the bottom left-hand portion. You also see here that we have a total of 4 different manifolds that these valves are mounted on. And then, like I mentioned earlier, we have the external pressure regulator if you have the foam eliminator system. And so what this means is you have more valves spread out over longer ranges. You have more wiring to connect all those to boards. You have a few more connections that have to be checked on, and then you have your connections on the outside of the instrument for your external pressure regulator. So in the new manifold design, we've brought all of those into one location and one manifold. It has 6 positions for valves, so it holds the 4 standard valves for all concentrators, and then it also has the 2 positions for the foam eliminator for the anti-foam agent and the rinse water. So all that comes into one location, and then again we've included this small internal pressure regulator, that drives the foam elimination system. And this is a view looking in from the right-hand side with that panel removed, and so you can see you have nice access to all of these valves, to the electrical connections on them, and then you have nice access to the plumbing connections from the front side through that door. And so it just really simplifies making any valve changes or checking any connections during leak checking and for benchmark testing when you're checking flow rates for your mass flow controller. Finally, from the hardware standpoint, like I mentioned, we have the new glass surround. So it's a little glass door here that protects your glassware and swings open, and the hinges are also keyed. So if you have restricted access on the right-hand side, let's say you have your concentrator set right up against your GC, or it's set up against the wall, or it's set up right up against your auto sampler, and you don't have full range to swing that door open, you can simply lift it up and pull it straight out. It comes right off. And then after you've made your glassware change or any other type of maintenance you need to do on the front of the instrument, you can simply put it back on, and it's back in place, protecting both the glassware from any accidental breakage and then also protecting the user from the heated sample mount. So right here. And then you still have full access to your sample introduction valve if you're running this as a standalone without an auto sampler. Okay. The last thing to touch on here is going to be the moisture management. So we have a new moisture control system that gives us improved moisture management. I think this is one of the biggest, most exciting new changes for the Lumin. And it works on the same condensation theory as the Stratums and previous models. However, it now includes a reservoir that's out of the Desorb path that allows those condensates to collect and then be baked out during the cleanup stages before the next sample. And so this has allowed us to realize moisture removals of up to 60% better than what we saw in previous models. So just to touch on a brief example of this, looking at the black line here is Lumin with a 4-minute Desorb, which is a classic EPA 524.2 analysis, where you mandated a 4-minute desorb. Typically see a lot of water issues there. You have a nice long water peak. Can really mess with gases, can mess with the first internal standards to come out, and the surrogates that come out in that water peak. The blue line here is the stratum, so what you might typically see, an elevated baseline out to upwards of even 5 minutes, even though you have a 4-minute desorb. However, with the Lumin, we're seeing a much reduced waterfront. And so what that's going to mean is more consistent retention times, and it's going to mean more consistent reproducibility from one sample to the next, which is going to mean your calibrations last longer. It's going to be easier to calibrate your data. It's going to be easier to analyze your data. You're going to have more confident results. So last but not least, let's talk about the software. So the Lumin TechLink has been redesigned to have a completely new look and feel. So the software is fully touchscreen compatible, meaning if you have a touchscreen PC, you can literally tap your screen to make method changes, to load samples, to abort, to choose whether or not to include a sample in an analysis. It's been streamlined. All of the functions and features are in a much more intuitive layout, so it's a little, in my opinion, quicker and easier to get to the tools that you're looking for, rather than trying to remember what type of menu they might live in, and you have to search down through the drop options and find it. Now they're in a much more intuitive layout. But it also has all of the features that you use most often. So we still have the full logging of changes that occur to methods, can't delete methods without archiving them. All the tools that you used in schedule building are still there. All of that functionality has been retained. It just has a new look and feel. And then, like I had mentioned earlier, we now use the USB connection for the communication with the PC. And so this means no more RS-232 COM ports, which are really hard to find on computers. You don't need a dongle to convert from RS-232 to USB. Sometimes those are tricky, can cause communication interruptions. We've avoided all of that mess and just went to USB. So here's a look at the main screen. When you open up your TechLink, you're going to get your main screen here, which is going to have 4 options. You have methods, schedules, tools, and help. So right off the bat, much simpler than all the different drop-downs up here. And you're also going to get this free-floating status window. Now the status window has a little pin here, and you can pin it so that when you minimize your Lumin TechLink, your status screen stays up. So most of the time, after you've built your method, you've built your schedule, and you're running, this information here is all that you really care about. That's all you really need to see. The more important thing that you want to have visible on your screen is your GC and what is it doing. So where are you in your GC schedule? What stage of its run is it in? And so now you have a much smaller screen that you can tuck in a corner to manage your limited space on your monitor. And it's totally free floating. You can move it around wherever you like. On a similar fashion, the schedule screen is also totally free floating and pinnable. So if you just want to have your schedule and your status window off the clear room, you can do that as well. Fully touchscreen compatible. You don't need the keyboard to enter numeric information or alpha information. So if you in a D column and you want to type in names, simply uses the touch keyboard that's built into Windows. So you enable that in your options, and then when you start up, that keyboard's going to pop up automatically, and you can type in any information you want that way. Totally free floating. We have multiple schedules at a time and see them simultaneously. So rather than flipping back and forth by clicking, you can now set both of those schedules side by side. And you can look at them. It makes it a little easier to compare one schedule to the other. Which one do I want to run today? It makes it a little easier to edit a new one. If you like what you have and you just want to replicate it with a few minor changes, it might be easier to see the old one to see what changes you want to make. You can have those side by side. And then all the same functionality is still there. 0 is blanks, so it can pull blanks straight from the reservoir of the Aquatek 100. If you click in the last, anywhere in the last line and hit down arrow, it's going to automatically add new lines. It's going to copy the information like the method and the standard selections that you've made, and it will sequentially count the numbers. So it would go 12, 13, 14, so on and so forth. Same with the use. If you have the use clicked, it'll have those pre-checked for you. Can only delete schedules after archiving. So once you've saved a copy in the archive folder, then you can delete it out of the software. things like that, so you don't accidentally lose a valuable schedule that you've built. And then you can also export schedules, as in the previous software. And then again, same type of features with method building, fully free-floating. They can be pinned, and you can have multiple methods open side by side in separate windows. So if you're trying to make a minor tweak to a method and you want to see what your old one was, you made a couple changes, you now go back and you want to rethink those changes, you can open up the old one and you have them side by side. It can help you make some of those edits. We've also reordered some of the options here under these tabs in what is a little more intuitive manner. So your purge is really just looking at all of your purge parameters. Your desorb is a little more focused on just desorb. Bake is a little more focused on just bake, and standby is a little more focused on just standby. So those tabs make a little more sense now than previously. However, again, a lot of the same features are still there, such as the description of each method parameter and what it does, the maximum allowable value, the minimum allowable value, and a recommended default. And then furthermore, the Lumin software comes preloaded with default methods that are, for most users, ready to go straight out of the box. Set it on the bench, hook it up, upload your default method, and you're off and running. It's really in increasingly rare cases where you'd want to make some changes. But fully editable, nice and easy to do that if that's what you'd like to do. And then again, can only delete after archiving, so you don't lose your methods, you don't accidentally delete it. And then you have the print capability as well. Last but not least, that brings us to the tools. That's our third option that we're going to use on a regular basis. And so what we've done is we've taken all those other functions and features that might have either been shortcut buttons or could be found through various different menus, and we've brought them all into one location. So for the most commonly used features, things that you want to just be able to go straight to it and push a button and have it happen, those are in the first two columns and in their own commands, right? So we have prime. We can prime our standards. We can prime all of them together, or we can prime our water for Aquatek 100. Each of those is just a button. So you click Tools, you click Water, and you're going to prime your water. Same with some of these commands over here. You want to run a leak check, Tools, Leak Check. If you want to bake out the system because you've installed a new trap, Tools, Bake. And then similarly, if you're doing some troubleshooting and you want to go straight to Desorb mode, Tools, Desorb. Keeps it nice and simple. For some of the less frequently used but still very important tools and tasks, they've been grouped into these last two columns. We have System and we have Diagnostics. So the system is looking more at your connections in your software, so the configuration of your current Lumin and how it's set up, managing your instrument, either that specific instrument or multiple instruments on your computer. And then System Properties, again, is looking at some of the hardware settings that you have for your Lumin. And then About is going to tell you about your software and your firmware, what versions you're using, that sort of information. And then finally, the Diagnostics column here is going to cover both the valves and flows in the Lumin, and then also in the Aquatek 100, and then also the motor controls in the Aquatek 100. So if you're troubleshooting your Lumin, you click on Valves and Flows. You can on and off, you can change the flow rates through your mass flow controller. And then if you're having motor control issues with your Aquatek, you have full independent control through the Aquatek 100 tab. And that really helps with troubleshooting and maybe with some specific testing if you don't want to go through a full benchmark test. You just want to try out a couple valves that you think you're having trouble with. It's a nice shortcut to do it that way. Again, full history logging, logs errors, logs instruments, instrument communications, and logs sample information. So pressures during purge, pressures during bake, when samples start, when samples end, if they foam, if they don't foam, assuming you have the foam eliminator system installed and enabled, and when schedules start, when schedules end. Any errors that occur get fully logged, and all of that information is can be sorted, it can be filtered, and it can be exported and printed. And then finally, we have an independent button for upgrading firmware and then the benchmark test. So if you want to run a routine benchmark to make sure all of the components of your Lumin are operating the way they're supposed to, as simple as one click on a button, and it walks you through the whole system automatically. So, just to recap on the new key features of the Lumin, we have faster cool down rates, and again that's made possible by dedicated ducting and a more powerful fan, and a little better layout of the trap box itself. We've simplified the maintenance and troubleshooting of the instrument, both through the one-door access to the trap and the consolidated solenoid valve manifold. And then we've integrated the pressure regulator for the foam elimination system onto that manifold, including the 2 additional valves that are needed to run that system. We now use a USB connection for the PC, so there's no longer any need to have an RS-232 port or to have some type of dongle to convert from RS-232 to USB. And then we're still using our superior U-shaped trap design, which gives us the benefits of shortened path length and then also the compatibility across multiple products. And then we're still using our electronic mass flow controller, which again is giving us full independent software programmable control over flows in all modes. It's giving us automatic leak check, and it's giving us electronic automatic recording of pressures. So pressures during bake, pressures during purge. And then last but not least, it's also giving us overpressure error warnings, and it'll shut off the flow if a blockage does occur, and that just prevents damage to the system, prevents cracked or broken glassware, things of that nature. And then just very briefly, I'm not going to go through this line by line, but just to very briefly hit on the Lumin specs. Cycle times of 15 minutes or less, and that's including an 11-minute purge time. So that's greatly improved over the Stratum, and again, that's mostly through reduced cool down time. Trap furnace reaches similar temperatures. All the temperature zones are very similar to the Stratum. Still using fully coated inert tubing and fittings. The mass flow controller still allows the user to choose either helium or nitrogen. So if you want to reduce cost in the lab a little bit, you can switch to a nitrogen purge. And that's pre-programmed in the software. You simply make your selection, and then the calibration in the mass flow controller switches to the nitrogen calibration. Dimensions are very similar. It's going to take up roughly the same amount of space on your bench. The software operates in a Windows 7 or greater environment. The TechLink, again, is interfaced through USB, and the voltages requirements are very similar to our previous models. Okay, so now let's touch on the Aquatek 100, which is our liquids-only auto sampler that is designed. The Lumin is designed to work with the Aquatek 100. The Aquatek 100 will be controlled through the Lumin TechLink. So the two combined would be a complete system that would be operated through the Lumin TechLink software. So just to touch on this again, it's a 100-position auto sampler. It uses a rotating platform, and then the needle slides out and pierces the vial. It also has its own water reservoir that can be used, is used for rinsing, and can also be used for blank samples. So for any blanks or any type of check standards that you just want to add surrogate standard or internal standard to with the standard addition vessels, those can be done from the reservoir, which means these 100 positions can be saved for actual samples, and they're not taken up by blanks and check standards, things like that. All Aquatek 100s ship with a built-in chiller plate that's standard on all units, and it's capable of chilling samples to 10 degrees C or less. It does require an optional recirculating bath. And as you can see, it's a significant savings over our previous waters-only auto sampler, which was the Aquatek 70. It also includes 2 standard edition vessels that work on the same technology as the Atomics. It has pre-programmed volumes of 1, 2, 5, 10, and 20 microliters. And then just like the Atomics, there's no waste generated when introducing internal standard or surrogate standard from these vessels. The only waste you ever incur in this system is during your initial prime. But once you have the lines primed and you have standard all the way up to the valves themselves, from there it's 0 waste generated every time you inject. And then last but not least, we have a nice slide-out drawer. It gives you full unrestricted access to all of the valves, to the plumbing connections. The Aquatek 100 does work on a sample loop system. So it's a pressurized loop, pressurize the vial, which pushes the water sample into the needle, fill the loop. That's based on time. And then from there, that loop is then drained to the glassware. And we offer standard loops of 5, 10, 20, and 25 mils, and custom loops can be made to any size depending on what your application may require. And then finally, the Aquatek 100 also incorporates a pH sensor as an accessory. So the pH sensor is located on the back of the instrument. The drain line from the lumen is connected to the well here. And then as the sample is drained from the lumen and passes through the well, the pH sensor reads the pH and then logs that in the schedule with that sample. So then that data can be exported into Excel, and then you have all of your sample IDs and you have all of your pHs for those samples. So depending on which methods you're running, if you have to verify that your samples are preserved adequately based on pH, rather than testing each of those individually by hand, the Aquatek 100 and Lumin together can do that automatically for you. So just to recap, the Aquatek 100 is fully compatible with the Lumin, the Stratum, and the Velocity. It works with all three concentrators. It has the auto blanking capability, so it can pull the water from its included reservoir. Remote access is available through the Lumin Tech Link, so similar to our other products. You can remotely access the concentrator through your software to see what it's doing, say, from your desk rather than going into the lab. It has more cleanup features in the Aquatek 70, so it's a nice step up. Has cleanup, so it uses hot water, has a water heater. It has the new standard edition vessels similar to the Atomics. A lot of nice new upgrades there. And then the full benchmark that the Lumin Tech Link does also includes the Aquatek 100. So it will also step through its motors and will step through its valves and all of its communications to make sure that it's performing as well as the Lumin. Okay, so now I'd like to switch gears and let's look at some applications for the new Lumin. So we're in the process of developing application notes on all major GCs for the Lumin. And we're starting by looking at EPA Method 524.2. And the reason we've chosen to start with this method is because EPA Method 524.2 uses a 4-minute desorb. And that 4-minute desorb traditionally causes a lot of issues with water for our users. And so we wanted to see if the Lumin performs any better with its improved moisture management over previous models. So what we did was we ran a Stratum where we used an optimized moisture control method, and that's where we really tweaked all of the parameters that we could within the allowable ranges of the method. So looking at increasing dry purge flow, increasing dry purge time, pushing all these things to the max to try to minimize the amount of moisture that's transferred to the GC, to get it as low as possible. And we used a 5 mil sample, which again, using a larger sample is going to mean more water vapor available. You're increasing the availability of water to be stripped and then captured on the trap. So by minimum we took to try to control that water vapor transferred. However, for the Lumin, we just used the preloaded default method, just straight out of what comes pre-programmed in the software. The only change we made to that method was to change it to a 4-minute desorb rather than the default 2-minute desorb. And then again, we also used a 5 mil sample here for consistency between concentrators. So how did it perform? The Lumin had more consistent retention times within that water peak, that traditional 4 or 5 first minutes where typically you see an increased baseline due to moisture coming from your concentrator. And then it also had equal or better sensitivity on the MDLs, again within those initial compounds, the early gases that come out within the water peak traditionally. So here's an example looking at deuterated MTBE in blanks. On the top here we see the Stratum. Retention times are fairly consistent, and I would say that recoveries here are pretty consistent as well. If I saw this, I would be pretty happy with this. However, we can see here on the Lumin, again looking at MTBE, we have much more consistent retention times. Those are locked in much tighter with one another, and the recovery is more consistent too. So it's a lot more reproducible here. So good results. These are what I would call great results. It's very excellent to see retention times that tight and recoveries that tight as well. And then looking at some of the target compounds, here's 0.5 ppb chloromethane replicates on the Lumin. And so we can see here again, we have tight, As compared to the Stratum, Stratum has a little looser of a retention time. There's a little more shifting there, and the recovery is not nearly as consistent on the Stratum as we see on the Lumin. So this is looking at 7 replicates overlaid, all of which are definitely coming out within that water band, because we're looking at a retention time of 1.3, whereas the water typically drags out to at least 4 minutes on this analysis. So we can see slightly tighter retention times and better recovery than what we're seeing on the Stratum. And then the final data also confirms that. So as we look at the MDLs of samples that occur within the water peak, we can see that the Lumin performs in almost all cases every bit as good or better than the Stratum. So we have lower MDLs. And then iodomethane in particular showed significant improvement over the Stratum, which again is another tricky compound that water tends to mess with a lot. So we're seeing really good results. Things are tighter. Things look a lot better on the Lumin, than the Stratum, and then that's mostly due to moisture management. So less water making it to the detector is going to also increase column life. It's going to reduce the amount of time or the frequency with which you have to clean sources. Less water is definitely a positive for GCMS analyses. So just to do a recap of the product line as a whole, all of our products incorporate the mass flow controller, which is patented and gives us pressure readbacks, one-click electronic leak checking, and gives us full independent control of flow through all modes. And that's all programmed within the software. So make a couple clicks, upload your new method, and you now have precise controlled flow rates in your analysis. We also have full diagnostics capability built into the software for all of our products. That includes both the benchmark test that will automatically walk you through each and every step, as well as the independent controls of valves and motors through some of the diagnostics tools, which will allow you to get a little more fine-tuned in some of your testing. And then last but not least, all of our products ship with our proprietary number 9 trap, which offers excellent performance for standard environmental VOC analyses and offers reduced water retention on the trap itself. And then looking at a review of the Lumin in particular, we have a shorter cycle time. And again, we've done that by reducing trap cooldown rates, which we've achieved by improving the fan design, both adding ductwork and increasing its capacity. And so this really just means more samples per shift, more samples per calibration, more samples per day, more samples per year. And then we've also simplified the maintenance on the system. So one-door trap access gives you full access to your trap and to the nuts. No tools required to get that door open. Easier and quicker access to plumbing connections during leak checks. And all this means less downtime, so your system is running more frequently. Looking at the software in particular, we've improved the layout of the software. It's more intuitive, yet it retains all the features that you've come to expect and that you really appreciate within our software. So it works every bit as well as it always did, and if anything, it's gotten better. It's a little simpler to operate. And then last but not least, we have the new USB control. So no longer need for RS-232 ports on your PC or the converters, which tend to have issues. Looking at Tekmar application support, we'd just like to point out that we have application notes for all the methods that we run with all the major GC mass specs, all major makes and models. We also have GC FIDs in-house, so we occasionally put out application notes on FID. And we do all the standard EPA methods, a lot of the standard methods internationally, standard methods, all of these we try to keep up to date on those for all of our instruments. We also do customized application support. So for more non-traditional applications, if it's a non-traditional application but we think there's wide use of it, we'll publish those as application notes. But even down to labs that have just one-off type goofy things that nobody else is looking at, we're just as excited to help them. If anything, I find those kind of things even more exciting because you're doing something that not very many people are working on. So we love to help out regardless of what application you're running, no matter what kind of issues you're having, we're always more than happy to help out. And you can reach out to us through the tech support or through our website. And then we will always do our best to match the instrumentation to the combination that you're using. So if you happen to be using one of the GCs that we have available in our lab, we'll absolutely use that GC setup. Otherwise, we'll do our best to come as close as possible. And so that just helps us provide solutions that not only work, but that we have a high confidence will work for your analysis. That wraps up the introduction of the new Lumin, and with that, I would be more than happy to take any questions.